Hi there, thanks for stopping by. In today's video I'm going to show you a few different ways to finish your handmade buttons so that you can make brooches, pendants, bracelets and anything else. So let's get started. The first thing that I'm going to show you is how to back your hand-worked buttons. This works for virtually any purpose that you want and for any hand-worked button. It's very easy and is a nice way to just finish everything off so that people aren't seeing the back of your button and your work. So I'm using a piece of slightly felted wool, but the easiest for most people is to actually use a piece of felt. So any sort of craft felt will work really well. It's nice and easy and you can get them in lots and lots of different colors. I just happen to have a little piece of this lovely wool left and it's so nice. It gets used for smaller and smaller things. Now, for this particular button, I'm going to make it into a brooch, but of course you can just do the stitching process without actually making it into anything. So I've got my little brooch back, and I'm going to actually stitch this onto the felt first. And so I like to, you could put it in the center, but I like to put it a little bit above the center line when I'm making a brooch, just so that when you're looking down at it as you are the wearer, it's not tilting too much. But that's just a personal preference. So I've got a piece of matching sewing thread, and I'm just going to stitch through the holes that are on the brooch finding and stitch this into place onto the felt. You could, if you wish, work a quite a complex sort of design and actually completely cover over the brooch if you wished. You can do some nice stitching over it, but there's really no need to. I mean, you're buying a brooch or you're giving a brooch, people will expect there to be a pin on it. And of course there are different types of brooch backs that you can find which will require a slightly different treatment. But I feel that if you put it onto the backing before you start, then any sort of mistakes you may make or any messy stitching can all be dealt with and be hidden. It just makes it a little bit easier. So that is stitched into place, and I'm just going to tie off the thread at the back. So I will put a little knot and then just secure that. As with anything, because it's a separate stage, trimming it off will mean that if anything does happen to your pin and you want to replace it, you're not going to mess up the integrity of the brooch itself. So I now have a long piece of thread that matches the felt back, and I've just attached it to the back of the button. Now you need to decide if your button has a right way up, which side is pointing up, so that when you place your brooch pin on, it will be in the right place. And do, if you need to, pin that to secure that in place. And then basically all I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch this to the back. You can just whip over by taking a stitch and coming down, and that is really the easiest to do. It's worthwhile trying to keep your stitches small and in line, and I do find using a longer needle, so here a long darner, that does help because I can pick it underneath the threads that I've used to wrap. Now this works with a ring button as well. You can go through the ridge at the back or through the blanket stitch on the edge. Now to get your circle, it's one of the easiest ways to do so is to take a button mold or ring in the same size but uncovered and draw around it. Then when you cut the circle, cut a little bit inside of that line. Usually that will be enough to ensure that your felt is just on the inside, because once that button mold's been covered and it has some thread on it and you've cut a little bit inside of the line, you usually find that sufficient to make sure that you cannot see the felt from the front of the button. So I've come full circle, and now I just need to fasten off. You can place a little knot and then thread through, but usually threading your needle back and forth and catching those covering threads is sufficient. So just back and forth in a few different directions, and that's very unlikely to sort of come up. And for the last, I'm going to pull this up quite tightly so that I can just trim. Hard to do it with the camera, to keep my fingers out of the way, I mean. So I'm going to pull it up and pull quite tight and then trim as close as I can. That means that the thread, because it's been pulled, will then sink down in. So this method is really, really good, as I said, for any backing, you know, without the brooch pin. You can go ahead and, even if you wanted to give these as actual buttons, you can go ahead and work a shank onto this at this point, and then give these as buttons that have the backs finished. A couple of things to note: if you're working a thread button, always make sure that as you're stitching you haven't dislodged any of the threads, because obviously sometimes that can be a problem. Likewise, if you're finding that your wraps or your stitches are very tight, which sometimes happens on a ring button, you could glue the felt down. Just make sure that you're using a nice glue and you get it around the edges, because you don't want it to sort of peel up. But this, using cloth, means that you cover, you know, any of the, because it's not perfectly flat at the back. So there's our brooch. Now you can use this same method, and instead you could stitch a little closed jump ring. So you could stitch this at the top to create a pendant, or a link if you wanted to link these together to make a bracelet, or you could use a stick pin fitting, which I haven't got, but poke that up through the felt first at the center. At that point I like to have a little bit of glue to attach the flat stick pin brooch back, and then the felt can cover it. You can also stitch, let's see, where did it go? This ring button, I've actually stitched the back going through in a running stitch, hooking it over the spokes. So it is another option. It looks different on the back, but it is an option that you might wish to actually look at. And again, something like this, I've just made little stitches because the points, doing a whip stitch around the edge, not always easy. So you've got a lot of options open to you about how to go about working them. So we've talked about adding a little jump ring. We've talked about adding a pin. Another way to make a pendant or link, which is a lovely way of doing things, is to cover a smaller jump ring in the same way as you would for a Dorset button. So with your blanket stitches, turning those to the back in exactly the same way. Now you can use a small ring to make a, like this, to make a pendant or a link to another one. You could, if you prefer, use a larger ring and then make something, you know, another pendant, or for instance, I have another video, my rainbow Dorset button, that has a large covered ring like this to make it into a brooch that doubles up as an eyeglass holder. So I'll pop the link to that video in the description box below. So I'll just show you how to do this. As I say, it's really nice, add something a little bit different. So I've got a long length of thread, and as you noted, I did already cover the back of this, but you could, in theory, do this attachment work and then cover the back. It's entirely up to you. Because I have already covered it, it's easy for me to sink my needle down and have my knot hidden without having to weave through. I can just secure it onto that. Now, your ring can be secured either very close or with a little bit of a space. Having a little bit of a space can be a little difficult. Let's get to the right section here. So I'm going to bring my thread up. I'm going to place the covered ring, and where my join is, when I start and my finish of my covering, I'm going to try to ensure that that remains underneath this covering that I'm now putting up. So if I want to have a little bit of a space there, one way to do it is to just have a pin. And you can just poke it through some of your covering thread. It will just help you to hold that, because obviously it's a little bit awkward, but it'll just help you to hold that at a little bit of a distance, because it will be the distance of the thread. Now if you want something a bit thicker than that, you could go with a thicker pin, and again just try to catch a couple of threads. Be careful that you don't actually split your thread. And then basically all I'm going to do, I got a bit of fluff on that, is I'm going to come up through the little loop, around, and so on. So I've worked a few stitches, and obviously remember that you do need to line this up if your design has a top or bottom, as with the brooches. And for the last stitch, I'm just going to secure this at the back. I'm going to make it quite neat. I'll go through on the direction that my thread is, so that I can try to keep it as tidy as possible. Of course, the front is the more important part to keep tidy. I'm just going to remove that pin, and now I can go ahead. I'm going to move this over a little because it's just slid out from that part that I wanted to be covered. So I know that's all right at the back. Take those ridges back around. And then I'm just going to wrap a couple of times because I actually put the pin in. If you don't put the pin in, you won't have any space to wrap. And obviously if you put something quite large in, you've got a lot of space to wrap. So that's quite nice. Looks a little bit like a watch, an old pocket watch fob. So then we need to fasten this off. And again, weaving through a few times is usually the best. But because we're fastening two things together, and we want to make sure that that doesn't go anywhere, I'm going to take this and weave it underneath, quite a ways down. And again, that's where long needles come in really handy for this sort of thing. And then I'm going to work a little. I'm just going to take, as if I'm doing a colonial knot, so I'm holding the thread taut. I'm just going to take a little hook under so that I've got a little loop, go in pretty much where I came up, and then off to the other side. Now this is going to give me a little knot, and then I can work another sort of stitch around as before, pulling taut. Just now tuck all of my blanket stitches to the back fully. And so that makes a nice little pendant or link. As I said, you could link up buttons to make some really unusual ideas. Now, obviously, a pendant, you wouldn't put your thread just straight through that. So you would either want to add on another jump ring so that it hangs through, obviously a smaller one than this. Or if you're using sort of a cord or thonging, fold it in half, come through, then take the two ends through that loop, and that's nice and simple to make a nice little necklace. So that's a necklace. As I said, you can just add a little jump ring on the back as well. That makes a nice little pendant. If you have access to anything like bails, again, they can just be stitched on. They can be stitched into place before you put on your felt. So stitch to the button, and then the felt can cover up the section as well. So that's another nice way. Now, of course, Dorset buttons and Zwarnknopf buttons being made on rings means that they can be joined quite easily together with jump rings. So if you have a larger jump ring, and in case you don't know, jump rings should not be pulled out apart but twisted open, okay, so that they sort of form this weird shape. That's the way to keep the metal intact. And obviously with the stronger ones you will probably need pliers to help you out. But basically you can go ahead and take your jump ring through a ring. If you have already covered the back with felt, which obviously is the easier thing to do when you're joining it. You can see I've already done this, but if you take an awl or a thick needle and push that through, felt by its very nature will just open up lovely. And that means that your jump ring can pass right the way through, and that can create a pendant or a link when you close it up. And of course, that doesn't answer the question of how you would link thread buttons over a hard form. So you could, of course, use any of the methods to add loops and then join those, so that could be joined to that, and so on. Or we do have on our website what we call jewellery button molds. And so these are button molds that have holes strategically placed. And so you can join them together basically. You can actually join them together with simply stitches. You could stitch through the materials in the same way as we did with the two rings. You can stitch through and then bind the two pieces. Or you can go ahead and join them with a link. So this particular button, again, just make sure that your holes are actually poked through your felt. And I would also say that if you use any of the star-shaped ones in particular, but all of them are pretty much the same, make sure that you leave space. Don't have them all right up to each other, because if you do that, you may find that you snap off a little bit of the button mold, and you don't want to do that. And never use the button mold itself to try to help you to close any of your jump rings. So go ahead and close that up, and I'll use some pliers later to just pinch those together closely. But as you can see, that also gives you a really nice way to join them, and a flexible way, so that's quite nice for bracelets. Speaking of bracelets, which, let's face it, button bracelets are really, really popular. So the easiest button bracelet to make is on elastic, and you are basically stitching all of your buttons onto a piece of elastic. Nice, quick, easy. What you need to do is measure out for your wrist, or the wrist, that a wrist size. When you do so, do not stretch the elastic at all, and it is a good idea to work it so that there's a finger underneath, so that your bracelet is not too tight. Then stitch all of your buttons on. Now, the other thing which is important is to have a little bit of an overlap on all of your buttons. That will help to ensure that the elastic underneath doesn't show. Okay, so I can't really show this to you on this one, but you can see that they do overlap just a little bit, but of course once it's made into a bracelet, it's not so easy to show you. So if you stitch them into place, and stitch each one singly, I would suggest don't carry on your thread, because again, if one happens to fall off, you will only lose one button, if that, but what you won't do is lose sort of the whole group of them. And then basically all you need to do is tightly stitch them together. So again, try to make sure that you have a little bit of overlap between your first and your last button, as it were. That's not always easy to do, and if you're working with different size buttons, it might be worth leaving one that you can use to hide the actual seam. Now the stitching isn't the easiest because you're working at an angle, but it's not that difficult. You just need to stretch it through. So that's stitched, and I've trimmed some of the excess, but I have left some there. You could, if you wish, also stitch that down just to make a really nice finish so that the seam is open, or stitch it to one side just to make it a little bit more comfortable to wear. The nice thing about elastic bracelets is if the elastic sort of stretches too much, you can always go ahead and replace it. And so that makes a nice, fun bracelet. And of course you can get all the different colored elastics if you want something different. Black is often very good. Another type of bracelet that you can make is a bangle. I have a complete video on how to make the actual bangle shape. These are really nice if you just want something a little bit more showy, and I will add a link in the description box below for these. So thanks very much for watching. I hope that gave you some ideas for finishing your buttons. If you enjoyed this video, do please click like and subscribe and leave me a comment. I love hearing what you have to say about the videos and what you're up to. And so, until the next time, take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.